Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Drawing Architecture. I'm Professor Mark Keene, and I'm going to work with you in draw along lectures on a series of topics over roughly 30 to 60-minute periods, depending on the complexity of the subject matter. This introductory short here is simply about preparing for the initial draw along lecture that you'll find online. So the biggest aspect for us is to transfer the language of drawing in perspective, basically cubic forms. Most architecture is found in cubic forms, and follow the principles of perspective, and then build that language of boxes in space into assimilating the language of the architecture in situ. So this is a classical building. We'll look through a whole series of architectural periods and styles over time, but basically I want to get to know you through your drawings, and basically because this is an async type of environment where you determine when you want to draw, you also have the ability to stop the lecture because I go at a certain pace for sort of the moderate level. So if you get too far ahead, just stop, start from scratch, do it again until you pick up those speeds, because it's like a foreign language and you'll need to practice. And so do a whole series of things over the course of time here. And we need you to sort of commit to that by realizing you're not going to be spectacular day one, but you will grow in terms of maturity and ability to draw architecture. So what we're going to do first is simply talk about the media, because what we draw with is essential as well as the principles of design here. So I encourage you to buy a color pencil, because if you came in with a traditional pencil, more of a true graphite, there'll be a range of value in terms of what you can get out of your media. And you want to have the strongest value change possible to give the most dimensionality and sense of perspective through value as well as perspective, which we'll go over in a second here. So the notion is any pencil will draw you a quick box, and any pencil obviously starts with 0 because that's the paper stock itself. And then depending on how much pressure you put on it, you can be very lightweight and you can get darker and darker and darker. And most pencils will end with value about this 50% range between 0 and actually black itself. I prefer if you bought a color pencil media, which is different. That it's sort of a generic term for having a different type of composition to the actual lead you're going to be using, which allows you then, with more pressure from your hand, to build up into the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and then finally the last bit to get to absolute black. And so that range within your work, we'll see with this first simple definition of a block of wood here, will pull the architecture off the page, because what we're doing here in perspective and drawing architecture is you're creating an illusion. Because basically we're working with a two-dimensional piece of medium here. We're using a point on our pencil, which is also sort of two-dimensional. We're going to build a language of 3 dimensions by light, shade, and the value inherent between light and shade. So what I'd like you to do is consider purchasing that. I'm not brand sensitive. These happen to be Prismacolors, and I buy them a box at a time. I believe there's either 10 or 12 in a box, and that saves you some money there. But you can also get other brands, like Blix has their version. That's a national company in the United States. Stadler is a German company. Castle does theirs. Crayola has one. Rose Art. And what you need to do is just probably spend your focus on just getting a series of black. And what I'd like to have you do is buy multiple ones so that you can pre-sharpen them, so you're not worried about having to sharpen as you draw. So you can have a whole series here for each sketch. When the sketch is done, then go back and sharpen them for the next one you open up. And that'll keep us in the same media here moving forward. And then you'll be drawing exactly with what I'm drawing as well. So that's important to me, that you buy black color pencils. Now you'll also be downloading a file for each drawing, and that file will basically be starter points for the actual form itself. Very simply put, in this case, this box in space has certain defining points at the corners, and I'd like to show you those tick marks and those corners on the base drawing that you will print out from a PDF. And then that way you'll know how large to do the drawings. You can follow the actual scale that I'm drawing as well. It's hard if we just do it on a rote blank piece of paper. So the principles now in terms of drawing are going to go back to probably your earliest notions of perspective, which some K through 12 programs teach in about 4th through 6th grades, introduce the idea of drawing three-dimensional things, because as children, we tend to play more in a 2D zone, and they kind of build in the science of drawing later on in grammar school. Then sometimes people self-select not to continue with art, and so they lose that dimensionality of how they draw. And so we're going to revisit some of those principles. It might be fairly redundant. It might be new for some people. And it might be a good reinforcer. And there's three key principles that we're going to work with here. The first is to locate the relationship of us to the subject, and that's by locating the horizon line. So on this, you can see I've got a very faint line. So if you can draw along with me, a faint horizontal line across the center of the piece of paper here. I use 11 by 17 paper because then it gives you the biggest image possible that I can work with my camera equipment here to get you the files. And the significance of this is that the relation between us and the subject is where we are relative to this in terms of scale, in terms of the presence of this. So right now it's smaller than my hand, so it's a small wooden block. I can change the scale of that and say, let's look at this block and assume it's a 2-story building. So it's deeper in one direction and shorter in the other. If it's 2-story and we know we're about 5.5 to 6 feet, 6 feet 5, whatever it is, we're sort of at the quarter section of a typical 2-story building right about there. That is our eye height against our subject. Our eye height has to be on the horizon line. That's how we see the world. So let's go back to who we are, and let's simply draw in the middle of our paper here a small head with the eyes being cut by the horizon line there. Once you have the head, you can then sketch in sort of a cartoon version of the torso, the body frame that takes you down to the waist, and then from there, the 2 legs that support you down to grade. So roughly in scale now, we've taken this piece of paper that had no sense of how big it was, and now you put a person in terms of a view shed, which is long and distant. Imagine a view out to a lake, to a horizon of a desert, to a setting sun, to the prairie fields, whatever openness takes you out to the edge of the earth. And I think that crown of the earth kind of curves away from us after about 8.5, 9 miles. So it really looks like a flat plane to us out in the horizon. So now to change the scale on this in terms of what the distance is between the person and the horizon line, we can put another person further away from us. So the head becomes smaller, and yet the proportion of the torso is the same to the legs. So now we've said that that's 6 feet tall, that's 6 feet tall, and there's a sort of projected distance between them, which is much longer than 6 feet because of what perspective's doing. Now kind of complete this with a triumvirate of a third person, and we'll say they're very close to us, which means the head gets larger, the torso gets larger, and the legs get larger. And so we continue with this line down there to the feet. We now have a third person in scale. And now I've created in your imagination the notion that this has depth to it. And we know by science and by our knowledge of a piece of paper, that's the depth of the piece of paper. And now we've given size and dimension to it. A whole different scale is implied upon the piece of paper based on the horizon line and ergonomic form once you get a scale indicator. Because the block itself doesn't really have any sense of just how large it was until I picked it up. It could have been a massive piece of paper and a large piece of wood until we know the scale of it. So the horizon line is going to help us start that. And the next 2 steps, we'll sort of ground it in the architectural realm of drawing 3-dimensional forms on a 2-dimensional piece of paper. So our next step then is to move into how we actually see the perspective. And I kind of cheated ahead here to show the lines vanishing. But on the horizon line are vanishing points, and 2 dominate. So we're going to work with the 2 most preliminary ideas of perspective by having the association towards those 2 points. So my quick diagram up here showed something that is a teaser between your brain and how your eyes see. because back in that first early geometry class, maybe that was in grade school, maybe early high school, but some sense know that these two parallel lines, either the two here, the two on this side, the two on either side going up, they're termed parallel because they never meet in space. They can go on for infinity and simply never meet in space. So they're truly parallel lines. And yet I drew that and it looked like a cube or a block of wood because I'm taking those two down and saying they're going to vanish to a point. And these are going to vanish to a point a little bit further out to the right. Now, what's marvelous about the science of drawing in perspective is that the 2 points are found on one line, and that one line happens to be the horizon line. So now setting our block down, we'll bring this corner down and we'll draw it as if part of it is at eye height beneath the horizon line. And then the bulk of it, another 3/4 of it, is above the horizon line. So the key is to start with the part of the box which is closest to you. So we'll draw this line down here and settle this box down onto our new horizon line. And we're just sketching, so we're not going to be point on and 100%, but as long as you're in the realm of 5 or 10% off, it'll still appear to have the promise of what this block is showing us here. And now we pick 2 points on the horizon line. I'm going to pick the points that look like this sense, but if I shift the points, what happens is the points aren't wrong, it simply rotates how we see the box. So that left vanishing point is a certain distance away. If I rotate the box this way, that point is coming closer and closer in, and it's pushing the right point further out. So basically, these two work in concert. We can make the box rotate by moving the points this way on the horizon line or this way on the horizon line. So let's start with one close like we did here and one further away like we did there above. And now simply you have to eliminate what you know about parallel and instead draw how you see parallel lines in space, and they converge on one point to the left and one point to the right. So the top comes down and the bottom goes over, and you reverse it, and the top goes over to the right and the top goes over to the left. Now, one thing about the technique of drawing, which you want to liberate yourself from, most often people will draw like they're printing or writing a letter with their palm on the paper, and they tend to move by not moving their arm at all. And that kind of gives you a rotation of an arc along the hinge of your wrist here, as opposed to a straight line, which is moving in one direction, nice and true. So think of this as your drawing utensil is from your shoulder to your pencil tip, and it's rigid. So you actually try to want it from one point and draw a straight line by drawing with your shoulder and less with the actual fingertips kind of writing. So bring those back, and you determine how much of the box you're going to see. And so that'll be over on one side dropping down, and then another on this side, and that will complete the box. So that'll happen in terms of rotation. If we move the points, let's just do this on top really quick, lightly. If I put the left point closer, you can see now we're going to see less of the left side of the box, which will push this one out farther and then tip these lines up. So you can decide in terms of the support, which I'll have for you as you print out your PDFs, but the support for you on site drawing a structure or something you want to draw, once you establish your points, you're a fixed view then. If you'd like to change that, you simply modify your points, and that kind of manipulates how you see the subject matter. So step 1, the horizon line. Step 2, the vanishing point, left and right. All horizontal lines must meet those points. If you look up, you'll tend to see angles in space, and you might think that's not possible. I'm going to actually draw this one differently. And all of a sudden the sketch looks wrong because you didn't follow that principle of only 2 vanishing points for all the horizontals going to the left and all the right lines going to the right. Our third point then is to again create this inherent illusion of seeing 3 dimensions on 2, because now you can see a block made out of pencil stock, on a piece of paper. And that's the scientific method of perspective drawing, which was sort of recatalyzed in the Renaissance some 500 years ago now, but probably established well before that, where people were drawing in perspective. For some reason in the Dark Ages, it got lost a bit in terms of the actual progress of more people developing it, and then rediscovered in the early Renaissance in the 1450s. So what we're going to look at next is then light itself. So with this box here, if I tilt it around, you can see that right away, the light above here from the document camera that's recording this shows a bright side on the top. It shows two gray zones here on either side that's not receiving the light as much. It's still lit up, but it doesn't receive the hot point of light. And yet beneath it, there's actually a real dark point which casts on the paper, and that's the shadow. So we have light, shade, and shadow in all of our drawings. So let's see how that would work here if we're going to assume that maybe the light is coming down on this front part. It's broader and deeper than maybe the side view of it. We could then assume that if you take your pencil and wash the left side, that already makes it seem a little bit more projected in terms of being a form in the space, because now you have the contrast of value and how the human eye sees. Without light, everything is black. Without value, the subject's just white. So we need to put in all of our grays from 10% to 90%, whereas the bulk of architecture really is in the sort of middle gray zone in terms of how we see things. When we leave the white or use the black, it pulls it out of the paper. And so we'll see that as we develop this particular sketch here. So our next point then is to assume that there might be a place for this block to sit on a site somewhere. All architecture has the ground plane as well. We've drawn from what we see standing next to a building, we see the two sides of it. But we're also standing on the base of it, so we can pretend this is on a lot that has a certain size owned by a group of people. So coming off the left vanishing point, we can establish that part of that property and come over the other side, bring it over to here, and then connect the two from the right vanishing point. So now we have sort of a basis for a tone we brought into the bottom of the cube, right around our two people here, that now creates another plane that makes the box seem like it's sitting on something that's perpendicular to our actual drawing plane. So now we're having planes in space move out in 3 dimensions. X, Y, and the Z plane. X and Y now with this ground plane, which helps create sort of a weight to the actual block itself, because we know the wood has weight, architecture certainly has its weight for itself, and it's hard to establish that unless you develop the ground plane as well. So that's the light side, that's the light side, the shade side, and now projecting down from there is the cast shadow. So if the light strikes here, it's going to take this whole form and throw a shadow, just like this one's doing here, onto the ground. So that will come at an angle off the front. And then when it stops, when that light comes down and hits the ground here, that thing is a horizontal line, will go back in space towards the left vanishing point, and then stop from this corner and return back. So now this whole area, the base of the ground, is our cast shadow. So that probably happens to be one more step of pulling that box off the paper. So that's our light, shade, and shadow, which simply put means you have to use value. And what's nice, this is a very simple tool that gets you all the values. If you use, again, a 2H pencil or even a 2B pencil, if you use softer lead, it's going to move around the paper a lot, because you can use an 8B and get this dark. Trouble is, when you move your finger across an 8B, it smears. This has more of a wax base and doesn't really trail so much. So it stays where you want it to when you draw. So now this is sort of how it expands in terms of the language of this. Everything around this that's horizontal will actually be part of these two vanishing points. It's not just your subject. So for instance, let's put a tree behind here. and have the ball of it kind of come up to our corner. And then we want to put a secondary tree here and maybe one on this side of it. If they're all planted at the same time, the same species, they're going to vanish as well. So the second head of that tree gets smaller, but it's the same size as this one. If we came over on this side, this tree on this backdrop, again, is the same type tree, but seems larger in terms of size here. But perspective says, oh, those are all the same type of trees. And because they're probably in full foliage now, having the ball shape, we can assume then that there's going to be a tone or a value for the natural part there. And we'll use that to come up to our corner. And then maybe fade away towards the edge, because right now our subject is this part of the building. That's the closest part to us. Once you delineate it and put in detail, you don't have to spend time adding more and more and more farther down the picture, because it dissipates the interest level further away from the key corner here. So that's our focus in terms of determination, the final value and detail of the sketch. Now, if you look way in the distance on a horizon line, there may be these same trees all the way back a half mile away, trailing back toward the horizon. So we can put the height of those trees here and their stem trunk coming down to grade, maybe one there on this side, and they just diminish in space. So that's how you can kind of change the scale and the distance as well. And maybe there's some type of vegetation of a small forest growing that distance. So you can build out the language of the sketch within that sketch, and again, providing any kind of horizontal or vertical on either side to the left or right point has to vanish back to either left or right. So now what we want to do is push, as we sort of wrap this up, because this is just a quick sketch here. Again, most of the content we'll be doing will be probably between 30, 45, or 60 minutes, probably at the longest. When you come to the last third of the drawing, all you're trying to do is keep focusing on the essence, and then pulling out a relationship between where you're going to make absolute black and where you're going to hold page white. So one of our key things here is to establish what lines are more critical than others. And that's by seeing the sort of cardinal rule there is that if the line holds space behind it visually, it's a darker line than if it doesn't. So for instance, if I try to push the pencil behind this front line, it never really hides the pencil tip. This line on the edge of the box on the paper, I can actually slide this behind in space, which means this line holds volume behind it. This one just shows the two surfaces meeting. So we want to come back to all the parts that have a stronger value intent to it, where there's space behind it, and then less when there isn't between the two. So the ground plane meets that, you can't find space, but those 1, 2, 3, 4 lines are stronger than the ones at the base. Same is true for the edge of the trees. Where it comes down and meets here is stronger. Where it starts from the building and dissipates out. And then to help, this is box-like, this is global-like, it's a big ball, but now it reads flat because the value is the same. We know the trees then come down and they cast shadows upon themselves. So the bottom third becomes darker for each of the trees. Now we're almost done. We can actually probably take that shadow now for our people. And right there, that person casts a shadow. It'll go back to the vanishing point. That person does. And then this one will come from this side as he's lit up. Now we're going to one little bit here. We'll be finished for our first introductory principles, 1, 2, and 3, which you really have to make sure those are blended, those ideas, into everything you draw. So what we have to articulate here now is pushing the blacks out and keeping the white secure. In order to keep the white secure, when we did this initial gray on the one side over here, it was just a tonal quality for the left side because it doesn't receive light. And yet, as we perceive this in real space, this gray next to that white appears darker than this gray next to a darker gray next to it. So this one will keep gray because we don't want to have to ever erase. We're just going to let that be the gray it is. But now we're going to come back to the right side of this cube and we're going to accent and keep pushing that gray to maybe a 70% black right up that edge. So now what I've done on the exact same thing that I know all receives the same light and think that is just simply the same tone across one skin, we're going to, through our drawing principles, move that from a darker gray to a lighter gray. And then move this from a darker gray at the base to a lighter gray at the top as it receives its light. And then we could adorn it with architectural features right now, but just keep it as a box because we'll spend the rest of our time together online doing all the ornate detailing of architecture through history. But in this case, the illusion that I want you to look at now is the performance of light, shade, and shadow, working with the ideas of perspective, horizon and vanishing line. Does it not look like the white here is actually brighter than the white here? It's the same piece of paper, but we've convinced the eye the illusion that this is a three-dimensional object, and it's not. It's lead on a piece of paper. By using the range of value we have in seductive ways so the eye is interested and intrigued by the idea of space and movement of light. Because the eye is a muscle and it likes to open and close across its subject. So our goal is, across of our sketching together, is to go from gray to dark to white to black to gray to darker gray to white. So there's an ebb and flow of interest level here. And we're trying to build up interest in the language of the architecture through the way we sketch. So those are the three principles that will be evoked through all that. Obviously, there's a lot more in terms of sensitive details and different shapes and forms we'll talk about later, but these are the cardinal ones you have to establish now and practice with. So download the PDF and be prepared for that. Have your black Prismacolors here. And if I can sell the notion of why we're drawing as we learn, is that you're going to retain so much more. 10% of what you read, 20% of what you hear, 30% of what you see, 50% of what you see and hear. But if you take what you're seeing and hearing and you're working with at the same time, it's almost a personal experience where you reach 95% of the content. So tomorrow, if you're to ask something on a blank piece of paper to draw what you heard about, it'd be difficult unless you drew along with me along the way. When somebody asks you about content of architecture from history and you read about it or heard about it, it'd be difficult to actually draw out the ideas. As designers and architects and people of the arts, you need to think with a pencil. It'll activate your brain cells, sharpen your memory. You'll be more observant. You'll concentrate better. You'll communicate finer. It also physiologically kind of works against your motor skills being stronger and strengthened, works against the notion of stress. It kind of releases it. It's work. When you're done after an hour, there should be a taxing element where you're sort of relieved, but it's a good relief because it releases endomorphines and gets you the ability to express yourself, which improves self-esteem, that you've got something that seems accomplished in a very short amount of time. And that's thinking with a pencil. So looking forward to the future here. Again, remember to always come prepared with the media there. It'd be nice if we all worked cohesively within that time, but I realize because we in a sense are all one-on-one here, you've got all the ability to slow down the video and rewatch certain pieces so that I can evaluate your work when you're finished at its optimum ability. Looking forward to it. Draw Along Lectures.